Hello everyone and welcome to Phoenix Gaming. I am your host Nick Henning and this is the second video in my series on Table Talk. I want to tackle today the big three: negotiation, persuasion, and bluffing. Essentially, these are kind of the primary components of things that I think about when I am doing table talk, when other people are doing table talk. Usually what I think about when folks say they like table talk games, I expect that there's a component of something like these along the way in each of them. So the idea today is that we're going to talk about each of these three, give some examples, how you can be aware of it, how you can be resistant to it, and how you can use it to your advantage. We're going to start off with negotiation. And when I'm talking about negotiation here, it can cover a lot of different categories, but specifically, I'm going to narrow in on this concept of a quid pro quo action. If you do something, I do something, or if I do something, you'll do something. These things can be positive or negative. It could be don't hit me or do hit this person. It could be something that is just, I don't want to be affected by that. And so you affect anyone else, I don't care who it is, and then I will do this positive thing for you. It can be I do something positive so that you don't do something negative, or I'll do something positive for you so you do something negative to this other player, or I'll do something positive for you so you do something positive for me, right? There's all sorts of different permutations of what this quid pro quo relationship could look like, but that's going to be my focus on negotiation, is that someone is promising to give something in exchange for something else. Some of examples of this might include something like, all right, well, if I give you this turn, then next turn you're going to have to give me the first card you draw. Or maybe something like, if you attack my Antarctica base right now, I'm going to hit you with every single one of these attack cards. That last one was really just a threat, but a threat is a kind of negotiation because it is essentially an exchange of something negative for something else negative, as long as it is true that you're going to follow through on that threat. Negotiation deals can be short-term or long-term. For example, all right, well, if I'm leaving you with that triple production, you have to pay me one of them every turn going forward. A negotiation can even include something nebulous or kind of undetermined at the point in time. I'm sure you've heard people say something like, oh, if you don't place in Spain, I will do something good for you next turn. I don't know what it is, but I'll get you back. Boiling it all the way down, it's essentially saying, I want you to take or to not take a certain action or actions, and in exchange, I will take or not take a certain action or actions along the way. That covers a huge ground, but it is sort of the core negotiation component that takes place in a lot of games, and it's available in all sorts of game types. Now, a big part of these negotiations and a big part of the question about this is, do these negotiations persist? How enforceable are they in the context of the game? And this is where a lot of the game designers step in to do the work for us. In Catan, I trade you cards and they trade right in the moment. The rules are a little bit more nebulous about what happens if I promise to give you a sheep now and you give me a wheat in the future. They don't really cover that kind of case as explicitly without things being traded hands. But I couldn't say something like, I would give you a wheat for a sheep, pass the wheat over to you, and then you just be like, psych, I didn't have any sheep in hand. It's explicitly not allowed. Something like Advanced Civilization specifically says you can trade a certain number of cards, and you have a certain number of cards, like you always trade in batches of 3, and you must be truthful about 2 of them. But the rest of it, it's all out the window. So you can trade even more than 3 cards, but only 2 cards require you to be truthful about the process along the way there. Some games like Sidereal Confluence explicitly punish you if you're not able to follow through on your promises for future turns, and the punishments are so severe that every player would go out of their way to avoid having those things happen to them. Essentially, games can decide whether they want those to be explicit deals or not. You'll see in a lot of Cole Wehrle games, they explicitly say deals aren't binding. People can say whatever they want to, and it's up to the players to determine whether they're going to follow through or not. This creates a really different vibe, and it is generally really helpful when these games that have these sort of core negotiation mechanics make it clear to the players what those negotiations can and cannot look like. In fact, certain games like Archipelago absolutely require negotiation to be part of the game. In fact, the kind of core mechanism of bidding for first player doesn't really work if the players at the table don't understand the negotiation that's kind of intended by the game design. And then in terms of keeping those deals where they are not binding, where they are sort of open-ended agreements, it depends a lot kind of on the context of the game. People are really okay in Game of Thrones or Diplomacy when you end up screwing them over. It's sort of actually almost like an expected component of the game. And they don't tend to take it personally because that's kind of the community that is built up specifically around those games and those structures. But a lot of other games are a little bit more ambiguous about what those negotiation deals look like. And so it's an important question to grapple for yourself. Like, what do you want your word to look like in a game? Personally, I am probably too honest for my own good in games. I don't make deals that I ever back out of. I think that's probably true in like 99% of cases or something like that. I'm sure that I could come up with one if I really searched pretty hard for a time when I did back out of a deal. But I find that it's really important to adhere to my word. I play so many games with so many different people that I find the value in my reputation to be more important than anything else along the way. In fact, I'm going to share a story about that reputation carrying across multiple games and how important that is in negotiation that completely shaped my opinion about this. I was a teenager and we were playing an online game called Age of Renaissance, which is this like old school Avalon Hill game that takes like 6 hours to play in real life. We would play by email before Board Game Arena was even a thing. And it had these obviously like terrible UI interfaces for how you would interact with the board and do certain things with each other. These two players had an agreement about who was going to play a card for the other person in whatever circumstance. I don't even remember exactly the context of the deal, except for the promise was that player B was going to play a specific card. But when it came time for player B to do that, player A had done a couple things to manipulate the board state so that player B playing that card would have essentially put player A into, in their opinion, an unlosing position. It would put them so far ahead. It's a really long game, so I'm not sure that that perspective is entirely accurate at the time, and also it's been so long that I don't remember the details of the story. The point is that one of the players welched on the agreement. Now, there's nothing in the game that forces them to do that, and there's nothing in the tournament structure that changed the requirement of doing that. But player A basically said from that point on, I feel like you've completely tanked my game at this point. Even if you didn't, it's kind of beside the point. I'm going to spend the rest of this game making a point out of this. And they spent all of the rest of the game focusing their entire energies on ruining the other player's game. They did nothing else. They came in absolute dead last when they did that, but they felt that it was more important to make the point that going back on a negotiation with them, a negotiation that generally in this community people would follow through on, to say, we're not going to have this kind of interaction again. And the lesson that it taught was not just to that other player. I know now, going forward, that if I ever welch on a deal with player A, this is going to be the result of that. And so there's something really powerful about the social situation you put yourself in when you interact with these sort of deals where you follow through or don't follow through. But again, it kind of depends on the stakes of the game and how big these deals are. In fact, I think that there are some games that have so many little negotiations in them that it's entirely possible that in the context of one game, you might kind of sort of break a deal with someone and then end up making another deal with them later. But a lot of games don't tend to have that many iterative deal-making moments when players make those deals with each other. It tends to be in these moments that are really kind of fire in the iron. We are achieving some sort of game state that's going to make a huge difference to what the result of this game is. And so those iterative processes don't end up happening. I find that most often people don't follow through on these promises when they're not really well established or when the stakes or responsibility are not well set out. This happens in games where people are trying to collude against a certain player. I was playing Risk Legacy and I had won some very high percentage of the games that we had played until a certain point, and every player at the table, every single game, agreed that they could not let me win the next game. But when it finally came down to do it, nobody wanted to be the person that fell on the sword of actually doing the attacking and essentially taking me out with them. It was too costly to essentially enter this collusive state where people would agree on something. If they had instead come up with some agreement like everybody needs to attack Nick once per turn, and if you don't, we will attack you, that might have been a situation that they could have pulled something like that off, but it's really niche and really specific. So it can be really hard to execute negotiations, particularly when things become more complex. For this reason, when you're negotiating, I recommend a couple things to really make sure that your negotiation is going to work. Thing number one, make it really clear what the benefit is to the opponent, and if you want to be this kind of player, make it really clear what the benefit is to you. The advantage of making it clear to your opponent makes it so that they understand exactly what is at stake. Making it so that it's very clear what it is to you means that they don't have this sort of suspicious hurdle jumping thing where they have to figure out what it is that you're getting out of it. People really have this sense of wanting to get equal benefits out of something. It's one of the reasons why I really like the game Sidereal Confluence, where you can trade almost anything. And I'm really good at it because I very quickly say, this is good for both of us. Here's what I'm getting. Here's what you're getting. And then people feel comfortable with making that exchange. The other thing is that when you get to a certain point in the game where you are perceived as being the person who is winning, then you have to actually consider making negotiations that are less favorable to you and more favorable to the other player, because people are going to be skeptical about wanting to engage with you in those things. And that absolutely makes sense. So by laying out right up front, hey, this is really good for you and marginally good for me, it really helps. Now, of course, a person can lie about these things. That is kind of the table talking component here. And that can work. But once you've established that you're a person that does that, there's not a lot of longevity in these kinds of interactions. So you have to consider and weigh sort of the cost of your reputation across multiple games versus your desire to win the current game. The second thing is that the terms of the negotiation need to be really clean and clear. This is one of the reasons why Catan is so successful. I'm going to trade you 1 wood for 2 sheep. It's a very concise, defined result and resource that works out. This is completely different from, we can't make Nick win this game at this time, right? Folks having a very clear objective, actionable, concise, specific, means that they can execute those deals more or less immediately. The third thing you really need for negotiation to work is exclusivity. The game Chinatown does this perfectly. You have certain lots. It says essentially, this lot is perfect for you. I've drawn it. I would like to trade for this reason. Monopoly is another great example of this. I have Park Place. You have whatever the other one is. And therefore, we have a reason that we need to engage with each other. Exclusivity means that a person is interested in negotiating with you. And then at this point, you're just looking to see how much you can make out of that interaction with each other. So if you're able to make your deals, specific, easy to do and everything like that, you're then asking yourself the question of, well, how much do I want to push in this negotiation? Sometimes you just piss people off and they won't trade with you because they don't like the idea of what it is that you're doing, or you're trying to ask too much out of the circumstances. And this is where being a strong game player really comes into play more than table talk skills. You need to understand how much you need to get out of a situation in order to accelerate your path to victory. If you're well behind the person that is winning, then you should be a little bit more aggressive in your negotiations, because just having modest negotiations means you're not really going to change your board state throughout the game. Similarly, if you are winning, just getting little edges along the way is going to continue accelerating you forward, and any acceleration is better than no acceleration. So making those value judgments of how much you want to push your luck in those certain circumstances really helps to figure out the negotiation process. So this is where we start sliding into the conversation about persuasion, how to actually get this negotiation to work out. And persuasion is a really tough topic for me to tackle here because it overlaps a lot with the other videos I want to do about sort of like body language, emotional state, and then also eliciting certain actions from other players. So I'm going to try to not step on the toes of those things and focus on persuasion instead, as just kind of trying to get someone to move along with you in a certain way based on the action that you're trying to do in the given moment. So for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to narrow down persuasion to sort of the 3 classic rhetorical devices: logos, pathos, and ethos, in order to convince people of something that you want to convince them of. And again, this is going to overlap with the other videos that I'm doing, but just bear with me as we kind of cover what these 3 are. So logos is the one that I talked kind of extensively about in the negotiation section, and I think is the one that probably has sort of the most appropriate place in board games for a lot of the terms and the kinds of games that you're going to be playing, particularly if you're playing in a competitive context. Logos is essentially the appeal to the audience's sense of logic, right? They're You're using facts or statistics, some value of the game, some very specific, usually mathematical reasoning that you can employ in the game structure to convince them. For example, I mean, those 2 banana peppers towards Frank are going to give him an additional $30. Whereas if you trade the 2 banana peppers to me, yes, I also get $30, but I'm offering you even more than he is. I'm offering you 3 different cayennes. Then there's pathos, which is the appeal to emotion, maybe using vivid imagery or creating stories and narratives along the way. You'd often see this in games that you would think that this would show up in. For example, social deduction games are a really good example where you might see someone saying something like, okay, but hasn't Josephine been extremely quiet this game? Like, when's the last time you've ever seen her act like that? Sometimes the creation of narrative also just helps with this persuasive component of leaning into this pathos. For example, okay, I know that he is ahead by like 100 points right now, but how incredibly epic would it be if we could knock down, so instead of you knocking me out here, and yes, I know that'll give you second place, but let's just like acknowledge that whatever, one of us is going to get second place. If we pull together and we attack first Australia and then you head up to Europe, we might actually be able to topple him. And then actually, like, you could score all the points at the end of the game. Or I could score all the points at the end of the game. It doesn't even actually need to end up being very serious. Sometimes just the emotional component of something that's on the goofier side can help you convince folks. I mean, admit it would be pretty funny if he lost from this position. Like, that would be pretty funny. And then also there's ethos or sort of credibility, sort of the idea that you are an authority on the game or anything like that. As we talked about last video, this can get into a little bit of, I think, the weirder territory of where things are uncomfortable, particularly if we're talking about rules. But experience also can come into play here, even with people who all have similar levels of experience. I've definitely seen people say things like, I mean, how often do you really see someone lose when they drop 4 iron in the first Canal era? In fact, that credibility argument can work even more powerfully on folks that do have similar levels of experience to you, because you can tap into sort of a fear, which is a pathos thing, of something that they have felt or experienced in their own lives. So your credibility can match up with other people's credibility to convince them towards certain courses of action throughout the course of the game. Let's move on to Let's move on from persuasion, though, and talk about bluffing. So I'm going to roughly define bluffing here as a intentional misrepresentation of your position, be it that you are stronger or weaker than you currently are, or it can be something that is about creating sort of like nebulous circumstances around hidden information. Hidden information might be like the cards that you have in your hand or the abilities that you have available to you that your opponents aren't aware of, but it can also be your line of action going forward into the future. An example of a bluff is something like, I mean, if you hit me, I'm going to use this card against you. And I used almost exactly that example in negotiation, but this here leans into the ambiguity of what that card might be for how powerful that bluff is. If you name something specific, then you are in a situation where your opponent can evaluate whether it's good or bad. But leaving things unknown, people tend to be very afraid of the unknown. They're very wary of things that are not necessarily in their control. So bluff can be used to enhance a negotiation that you've engaged in, or it can be just entirely on its own. If you want to get good at bluffing, you can just watch a lot of poker players. There are, of course, a handful of different ways that folks act essentially in order to execute a bluff. Most people at the poker table are just impassive, right? They don't do big personality things. They just kind of try to keep themselves as stone-faced as possible, and they present sort of the situation as it is and let you essentially make the decision at chips as they fall. That doesn't necessarily seem like it's a bluff, but that's just sort of, I mean, it is, because you're essentially having to gauge their actions, not based off of their persona. But certainly people will also use their persona to sort of present things. They start talking a lot, or sort of like kind of start barbing you or trying to goad you into action or something like that. That could be a bluff that generally is communicating, I'm feeling confident, I'm feeling stronger, and so you should be scared of me, right? The more bravado at the table, the more you suspect that person is, in a powerful position. But of course, we generally know this or have learned this through the course of our lives in one way or another. And so that bravado can be fake bravado. And that is where the bluff comes in. And that comes down to sussing out the individual and trying to make a sense of them. If you're really not sure or you're not good at reading people around these things, don't try to read them. Just base it based off of your decisions on the board state of the game and consider what it is that's going to happen in your worst case scenario, in your best case scenario. And then, of course, that the opponent is incentivized to, drive your action in a certain direction. So you don't take what they say necessarily seriously, and you have to consider whether they are kind of just like actually presenting information or not. In my general experience, the less information that people are giving you, the more likely it is that they're bluffing because they want the situation to be ambiguous. I think the other kind of bluff that comes up a fair amount in board games, actually maybe even more than the bluff that we're talking about, which tends to be sort of the like bigger, dramatic, I have this situation or I'm presenting a strength, is actually feigning weakness. It can come in, and we're going to talk about this more in the next video when we talk about body language, but sort of feeling kind of detracted. The cards in my hand are just, I'm not going to be able to like finish this game. And those kinds of representations of your board state that you're actually just unable, that you're out of gas, are a component of bluffing. In fact, I kind of have this sense that like at least half of whining during board games is really just a form of bluff. These cards just are not cooperating with me right now. Sure they aren't, buddy. The problem with bluffing is that, of course, if you end up being a person whose bluffs are revealed, then they're only going to last a certain amount of times in certain kind of games. This works maybe if you only play certain kinds of games, certain amount of times with people, or if you're kind of like rotating through different instances. It works if you're not playing with the same people very often. But in that case, if you're not playing with the same people, they're a whole lot less likely to trust you. Bluffs are most powerful when they're used against people who do have some sense about who you are and how you're going to choose to play the game and what the sense of that is, rather than them kind of leaning into the board state. In fact, you can kind of employ people's impressions of you as a way to sort of change their expectations of what your behavior is going to be. So for instance, if you have established a reputation of somebody that can't be trusted, then you have to work a whole lot harder to overcome that. But instead, if you end up taking a course of action that would surprise people at the table, that you did follow through positively on something, the other folks that are not engaged in your negotiation might end up getting blown out because they're like, oh, like Nick's, he's going to betray you. So I don't have to take what he's saying about that serious situation seriously. And then they might end up making mistakes because they know that I'm, a person who's commonly betraying folks or anything like that. If you're trying to execute a bluff, there's kind of a couple components that make it most important. One is that the bluff needs to be believable. There needs to be some realistic circumstance in which you have it, and you're not just kind of creating a fake circumstance. I think that should be pretty obvious, but before you just start kind of like saying things, you need to make sure that you're creating a world state that seems reasonable. The second part of a bluff, and this is the one that people screw up most often, is pretending that that world state is true. When you look at some of the best bluffs in poker or in Magic or anything like that, they always talk about how these players have essentially established a certain world reality in advance of the actual bluff itself. A bluff just kind of fired out of pocket usually doesn't mean anything. But if you've played in such a way that posits that a certain world is true, a certain kind of set of circumstances exists, then people are inclined to think that that's possible. The problem with this, of course, is that you need to play in such a way that is beneficial to your actual true world state rather than the world state that you're faking for. And so you're trying to, a lot of times when you're setting up a bluff or setting up the possibility of a bluff, trying to set up essentially a quantum board state, what it would look like in this position, what it would look like in that position. Let's take an example like Inish, for example, where you have cards that dictate what kinds of actions you could take. And suppose that you were trying to achieve a certain win state, and you could only do that if you had an attack card in your hand that allowed you to move your troops out. Now, a lot of times you might want to choose to slow roll those attack cards until later so that you can kind of make those decisions after everyone else has already used their attack cards. Well, you might instead, if you have just the one attack card and you think that you actually can't wind up winning this turn, play an attack card really early in the turn. Take something out and kind of claim territory that you want to, knowing that you won't be able to respond later, but knowing that your ability to essentially reach for victory that turn is very low. By attacking early in the round, you sort of have suggested to people, hey, you probably have a second attack card in your hand, and therefore they might end up slow rolling in a way that they necessarily shouldn't have, and allow you to proceed to get some nonsense done while they are outweighting each other. This is an example of a bluff that works because you have created a world state that would be your best world state where you have a second attack card available to you. And because you have the second attack card available to you, you have chosen to attack early in the round because you know you have a backup plan along the way. You instead have essentially foreseen that this is the situation that you're going to be in. You know that that last attack isn't going to get you quite across the finish line. So you make it so that other people think that that is the situation so that you can prioritize other processes throughout the course of the round. Some folks are maybe really good at reading people. I am not. I tend to not trust my instincts on just kind of like sussing out what other folks are doing in a given moment. But I try to really take this perspective of not only what do I think the value of a certain action is, but did the preceding actions to this moment suggest that kind of this might be the reality along the way here. And so allowing the game's actions to tell the narrative is the way that I think you can be kind of most resistant against folks bluffing you out of doing certain situations. Keep in mind that bluffs rely very heavily on fear. The idea that you do not know what is going to happen. And sometimes you just have to make a move and it's your best play because you don't have any other options. A lot of times I see people falling for bluffs when whether they stumble into the trap of the bluff or not, they're going to lose one way or another. So also knowing your personal board state and not reacting to that emotional concept of, I don't want to be wrong. I don't want to look like an idiot if I walk into this trap. Well, sometimes you have to walk into the trap because you were kind of in a bad situation if you didn't walk into the trap. So you have to kind of hope and pray that it worked out for you. In fact, in a lot of ways, those circumstances are the best because you don't have to worry about whether you making the right call or not in terms of their bluff. You kind of have to. You're doomed otherwise. It's really more the circumstances where it's like a kind of small valuation difference that may or may not in the long run make a big deal that makes people really fearful. And that's when bluffs are most powerful, when the stakes are not game ending or game changing, but just a little bit to get those little edges along the way. So micro bluffs tend to be far more important than macro bluffs. A quick example of a story about this. I used to play a lot of Fury of Dracula. Fury of Dracula is a hidden movement game where you sometimes know that Dracula is moving, particularly when he is on the ocean, because he takes damage when he's on the ocean. He plays different cards. And so usually Dracula doesn't want to go to sea unless he needs to get out of a certain location and go somewhere else. Well, as we were learning this game, sort of patterns and flows like that, people started getting very inventive with their moves. So a kind of classic example now that at the time was extremely novel was having Dracula depart from a port to essentially land more or less in the same location. Maybe they had the same card somehow, or more realistically landing just adjacent to where the port was, going essentially nowhere. They could have just walked by land instead and going out to water to do that. Everybody then assumes that you've maybe jumped the channel to get somewhere else, and they start saying, okay, well, we need to move in such a way to close the net over here. But sometimes doubling back is a really, really powerful move in hidden movement games. And so at the time that someone pulled this off for the first time, it was a really incredible bluff. And frankly, it was just one move sequence there where they could have ultimately moved away in a different way. But those moments in hidden movement games are really powerful because there are so many little instances of unknown information that can be deployed in that game. So what do you think? What negotiation, persuasion, and bluffing strategies have you used? Which is the thing that you think maybe crosses the line a little bit? Which are the things that you think are appropriate? Are there any games that you think are really good at executing any of these or good practice for folks to get in? Thanks for watching.